Whoopee! It is Friday and it's payday. The 28th of February. Isn't that wonderful? As you joined us, you're on the Fifth Connection. We are live and we continue in walking through the storyline of this very important idea, the idea of stick-to-itiveness, sticking with the program, sticking to Jesus, holding on. Constantly holding on to the confession that we have embraced. Because you see, challenge brings change. Challenges bring changes. That is true in any and every sphere of life. We think of the major shifts happening in our own country. Crucial support staff are being lost as hundreds of millions of US dollars are pulled out of our public health system to combat HIV and AIDS. And you may or may not know this. We have the highest AIDS statistic that's constantly climbing, and it's the highest statistic in the world. We are involved in a particular ministry in the area of KZN that is the most deeply infected HIV AIDS area on the planet. And so we are in dire straits as over the next, less than 90 days now, people will be out of a job. Researchers will be out of a job. Those are doing crucial and critical research on HIV at the rock face. So we are heading for a very, very challenging time because you see, change is like that. Change brings with it great challenges, and if we are not prepared for it, we are going to pay the price over a 30-year window of democracy. We've not been able to come to the table in supporting these processes ourselves. And so we've been heavily dependent upon the US taxpayer. Think of it. The US taxpayer has been footing about 17% of that bill in the area of health. So yes, great challenges for us. And so our government and our people have an obligation here and a duty to act with great urgency. And change and challenges come often at what we would consider the wrong time. Couldn't these challenges just wait until I'm a bit older, until I have a little more money, until I'm a little more stable? And there we go, with all kinds of reasons for why challenges and change is inappropriate. What comes at the wrong time. And so the writer to these Christian Hebrews is addressing the issue of these followers of the way going back to the old way. What was the old way? The law, the old covenant. And of course, being Hebrews, they would have a great sentiment and a great connection with that part of their history and a part of their culture. But the writer, across 303 verses of the story, is unfolding a progression. Jesus is no small fry. He is the superordinate son in the first 4 verses of chapter 1. And then from verse 5 of chapter 1 all the way to chapter 10, verse number 18, is the superordinate walk because of his person and his work, his worth and his work. And then from verse number 19 through to chapter 13, we have Jesus as the superordinate way. But we are in a section of the text where we're talking about this cryptic king and the challenge that comes with understanding what the writer is doing with this man with this long name, Melchizedek, Melchiz, if you will. So Melchizedek and Abram are contemporaries. And Abram meets this fellow, because he's a human being, meets him in Genesis 14. Now, I've spent at least 4 or 5 blocks on Melchizedek. And we spent a lot of time in Genesis 14 looking at that passage, then looking at Psalm 110, and then looking at the intertestamental period, the 400 silent years. And we tracked through how Jews during that time were trying to connect the dots and came up with a lot of interesting ideas. And you will remember that nowhere in the Old Testament is Melchizedek spoken of as a divine person. He is a human. Now, some would say, well, he's without father and mother. Well, the reference to being without father and mother is a reference not to bastardize this individual. He's illegitimate. He's out of wedlock. But more the idea that he doesn't have a priestly lineage, doesn't have a priestly genealogy, a family tree. And God brings him into the picture because the one who would follow after that order, the order of Melchizedek, is Jesus. And we looked at verse 11 to verse number 17 of chapter 7, and we saw that the new person, who's Jesus, is a better priest because the old system had insufficiencies built into it. Because you see, paradigms are like that. A paradigm is a cluster of models. Thomas Kuhn, his book on scientific revolutions, talks through how we go through these paradigm shifts. We went through a paradigm shift in this country from apartheid, which is ruled by a small group, an oligarchy ruled by a minority over a majority, and we shifted into rule by the people, for the people, from among the people, which broadly speaking is what democracy is. And so these Christian Hebrews came out of a paradigm. But the paradigm had insufficiencies in it. It had a default setting. It had specific things that it wasn't designed to do. For example, the law was not given to save anybody, so that if you kept the law, you could be saved or could get saved. And the whole of Romans 2 talks about, in a very exaggerated, hyperbolic way, that if you could keep the law with perfection, all the works of the law with 200% perfection, you'd be saved. Now we know that's an impossibility. But if that were possible, great. The law is the way. But the law is not the way. Jesus is the true and living way. John 14, verse number 6. Now this morning, let's look at 2 verses. Verse number 18 and verse 19 of the story. Because not only is Jesus, the new person, a better priest in verse 11 to 17, but this new priest brings with him a better hope. He brings with him a better hope. Why a better hope? Well, let's look at verse 18. For on the one hand, a former commandment is set aside, the previous regime, if you will, of the old covenant, because of its weaknesses and uselessness. Oh, now those are strong words. Weakness and uselessness. Now, this is some strong words for those who want to move in line with what we call Hebrew roots, the Hebrew roots movement, or the Hebrew Israelite movement. There are many Christians today, many Bible believers who think that they are more biblical and more spiritual if they were to embrace Judaism, if they were to wear the prayer shawl. I have nothing against the prayer shawl per se, but they feel that if they adopt these Hebrew traditions, they are closer to what God desires. Wow, this is a terrible book for Hebrew roots. All 13 chapters of the story speak out strongly against its weaknesses, and now that it has become obsolete, useless, very, very strong words. And verse 19 goes on to say, "For the law made nothing perfect. But on the other hand, a better hope is introduced through which we draw near to God." Now, let's just land the plane here for a bit. Jesus, the new person, is a better priest, and Jesus, the new priest, brings a better hope. Why is this hope better than that which the old covenant produced or enacted? Well, what is hope? Hope, in a sense, is a very present future, bringing the future into the present and living in the light of that. We have a hope that is steadfast and sure, the writer of Hebrews says. We have an anchor within the veil. Our hope is grounded, it is moored on the other side of the curtain because the curtain was torn in two. And so our hope is steadfast and sure. That's where our hope is. And no matter how we get shaken by the uncertainties of life, our hope is steadfast and sure. Have you ever, as a parent, had one of your friend's kids, when they were little, come and knock at your door? And they would knock at the door and you would open and you'd say, "Hi, Johnny. Hi, Joey." And Joey would very quickly respond, "Is Beagle here? Is Bronwyn here?" And before you can even answer whether they are here or not, the kid zip right by you and goes into the house and goes and finds the person they're looking for. That's the kind of access I have, that you have, that these Hebrew Christians have. Access to the throne room, access to draw near to God. What does Romans chapter 5, verse 1 and verse 2 say? It says, "Therefore, since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God, true peace, through our Lord Jesus Christ." And now the kicker. "Through him we have also obtained access by faith." It's about access by faith into this grace in which we stand, and we rejoice in hope of the glory of God. There it is, the chain of hope that runs through Romans chapter 5. This hope is not based upon any kind of certainty that we can give, but it's based upon a certainty that is anchored within the veil, that is steadfast and sure. You see, we love certainties. We are given to living our life with certainties. I want to be certain of my future, my investments, successful kids, calm surroundings, beautiful home, and all that goes with it. But you see, certainty can only bring about a certain kind of resilience and robustness. Something that is robust doesn't break easily. Something that is resilient can break, but after a while it bounces back, and then it breaks again, and then it bounces back. Or often the certainties that we have are just fragile. They keep breaking all the time. Just break, 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 break. Certainties that are anti-fragile are certainties that are steady and sure. But what the scriptures presents to us as Bible believers is to live with be able to live with uncertainty, to live with what is called tropophilia, to live with those uncertainties, the things we can't be sure about. We can't even be sure about our insurances and what we have assured and insured in our lives, because those things can crash. Our offshore investments can crash. Paul says, I become all things to all men. Well, what is that about? Paul has become metaparadigmatic. In other words, he's become multi-perspectival, and he can look at life from many different vantage points. From the point of view of the Jew, then of the Gentile, then of those of mixed race, the Samaritan, and everything else in between. I think those who come from a mixed background in this country have a unique ability to see life from many different perspectives. And while they struggle with their identity, the so-called colored people in South Africa, they have a unique ability. They can play it on many sides of the fence. And in some ways, they are chameleons. They can live like chameleons in a Smarties box. That's very true, but it's also very unnerving. Paul says, I can become all things to all men so that I may win some. He knows what it is to shift in and out of paradigms and not get caught in it. That's why we need each other, because you become the eyes in the back of my head. I don't have it down with perfection, but you can see my inadequacies and my faults and my shortcomings in my thinking. What have you identified this morning as facilitators in your move from what is old to what is new? In your move from what is familiar to that which is unfamiliar? How are you navigating? Are you navigating well? Are you constantly bashing your face into a wall because you are not identifying what facilitates better moves, better navigation skill? Well, if you haven't identified the facilitators, here's another question for you. Have you identified the debilitators in your move from the old to the new? Whatever the old to the new looks like for you. For these Christian Hebrews, it was moving from Judaism to followers of the way, to becoming Bible believers, New Testament Bible believers. They had a great struggle because they stood in danger of defecting. And Paul says, or the writer of Hebrews says, I expect better from you, better things of you. You haven't defected yet, but I'm expecting better, that you would do what becomes and belongs to salvation. Have you identified those facilitators? Have you identified the debilitators, the things that are drawing you back from moving on to the next thing and the next and the next? Or are you constantly living in the land of excuses? As someone has said, an excuse is a skinless sausage without any meat. Think about that. A skinless sausage without any meat. That's exactly what an excuse. Rather than taking life by the horns, living life to the hilt. Identify the debilitators, but also identify the facilitators, the things that work for you so that you can move on. I trust that you have been encouraged on this payday of the final day of the work week for many of us. We'll be back with you on Monday for the next exciting episode at the same time in the same place. May God bless you and have a blessed day.